The Astoria glided through the endless void, a gleaming spear of human ingenuity against the cold black canvas of space. Inside, the crew moved with a sense of quiet determination. It was a long journey, nearly 3 years, and each of them bore the scars of isolation in different ways. But now, as the massive orb of Neptune grew larger on the main viewport, a spark of anticipation broke through the monotony. Commander Elias Voss stood at the center of the bridge, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the planet. He had always thought of Neptune as serene, its sapphire hues swirling gently in every image from Earth's telescopes. But up close it was anything but tranquil. The storms churned with ferocity, massive systems of dark clouds twisting and colliding like battling titans. "ETA to orbit insertion?" Voss asked, his voice low and steady, masking the unease tightening in his chest. 32 minutes, replied Lieutenant Marco Hayes from the pilot's console, his fingers deftly adjusting the ship's trajectory. Marco, ever the daredevil, leaned back in his chair with a grin. "Piece of cake, Commander. Just a quick dance through some turbulence." Dr. Lena Moreau, seated at a workstation, glanced up from her readings. "You might want to reconsider that confidence, Lieutenant. These wind speeds are violent enough to shred most spacecraft in seconds." She pushed her glasses higher on her nose, her tone clinical, detached. Marco chuckled. "Not this one, Doc. She's built like a tank. Isn't that right, Zeke?" Zeke, the young engineer crouched under a panel in the rear of the bridge, muttered without looking up. "Sure, unless you push her too hard. Then she's a tank with a blown gasket." "Focus," Voss said, cutting through the banter. "We're not taking any chances. Let's do this by the book." As the ship descended closer, a strange static buzzed through the comms. Lena frowned and adjusted her headset. "Commander, we're picking up an anomalous signal. It's faint, but consistent." "What kind of signal?" Voss turned to her, his brow furrowed. Lena's fingers flew across her console, isolating the frequency. The sound filled the bridge, faint, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "It's not natural," Lena said after a moment, "but it doesn't match any known patterns of artificial transmission either." Marco leaned forward, his grin fading. "So, what is it?" "I don't know," Lena admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's coming from deep in the clouds. Could be interference or something we've never encountered." "Log it," Voss ordered. "We'll investigate once we're in orbit." The Astoria trembled as it breached Neptune's outer atmosphere. The turbulence was unlike anything they'd experienced, gusts slamming into the hull with alarming force. Alarms chirped and Zeke scrambled to recalibrate the stabilizers. Marco's hands danced over the controls, his usual bravado replaced by laser focus. "Hold steady," Voss barked. "I've got it," Marco shouted back, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. The ship groaned in protest, but after a tense few moments they stabilized. As they settled into orbit, a tense silence filled the bridge. Voss exhaled slowly and looked out at the swirling storms below. Massive dark patches marred the planet's surface, like scars running through the chaotic sea of blue and white. "Commander," Lena said softly, breaking the quiet, "there's something else." These storms, they're moving in a pattern, not random." "What do you mean?" Voss asked, his tone sharp. "I mean," she hesitated, "it's almost as if they're reacting to us." The words hung heavy in the air. Marco laughed nervously. "Come on, Doc. Clouds don't react." Lena didn't respond. Instead, she brought up a visualization on the main screen, showing the atmospheric activity shifting subtly as their ship moved. It was faint, but the correlation was undeniable. Before Voss could respond, the faint signal pulsed again, louder this time. It reverberated through the ship, rattling equipment and sending a chill through the crew. Zeke emerged from under his panel, his face pale. That didn't sound good. "It's nothing to do with the ship," Lena said, her voice tight. "That came from out there." Voss straightened. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Lena, isolate that signal. Marco, keep us in a stable orbit. Zeke, I want every system checked for anomalies. Let's stay focused." As the crew dispersed to their tasks, the bridge settled into an uneasy quiet. Voss lingered by the viewport, staring down at the swirling storms below. The faint signal continued, like a pulse, steady, relentless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, hidden in the depths of Neptune's clouds. For the first time in his career, Elias Voss felt small and exposed. The Astoria's probe disappeared into Neptune's roiling atmosphere, swallowed whole by a vortex of thick cerulean clouds. On board the ship, the crew watched the feed with rapt attention, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of their screens. The probe transmitted data in bursts, pressure readings, temperature spikes, glimpses of strange, undulating formations suspended in the storm. "What are those?" Lena whispered, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ship. She leaned closer to her console, transfixed by the images. The formations resembled enormous web-like structures, organic and pulsating faintly, as though alive. "No known atmospheric phenomena match this," she murmured, almost to herself. "These are biological." Before anyone could respond, the feed abruptly cut to static. The signal was gone. "Probe's offline," Marco announced, his hands hovering over the controls. "No chance of recovery unless we go in after it." "That's insane," Zeke said, spinning his chair to face the others. "The storms alone would crush the lander, not to mention whatever the hell those things are." "We can't ignore this," Lena interjected. "If these are living organisms, they could be a breakthrough. Proof of life in the outer solar system." "It's not worth the risk," Voss said firmly, though his eyes lingered on the last captured image, the haunting web-like structures seared into his mind. But the faint signal returned, cutting through the static. It was louder now, almost a beckoning call, rhythmic and deliberate. Voss clenched his jaw. It felt like a trap, but leaving without investigating would mean failure. He couldn't let another mission end in regret. "Fine," he said after a long silence. "We'll take the lander down. Marco, Lena, Zeke, you're with me. Minimum time spent in the atmosphere, and we pull out at the first sign of trouble." The crew readied the small landing craft, its surface reinforced for extreme conditions. Tension hung heavy in the air as the vessel detached from the Astoria and began its descent. The craft jolted violently as they entered the atmosphere, turbulent winds battering its hull. The viewport showed nothing but a swirling haze of blue and gray. "Stay steady," Voss said, gripping his seat. "We're in this together." As they descended deeper, the chaotic storms began to part, revealing an alien world unlike anything they'd imagined. Massive, translucent creatures drifted lazily through the atmosphere, their bioluminescent bodies glowing faintly in the gloom. They resembled jellyfish, but were far larger, easily the size of skyscrapers, their tendrils stretching impossibly long, disappearing into the mist. "Unbelievable," Lena breathed, awe momentarily overtaking her anxiety. "They're peaceful, just floating." "Let's hope they stay that way," Voss muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the probe. The lander's sensors pinged as they approached the web-like structures. Up close, they were even more unsettling, vast organic masses, their surfaces alive with faint ripples and pulses, as if breathing. The probe was embedded in one of them, tangled in the fibrous strands. Marco maneuvered the lander closer. "All right, let's get this over with. Doc, you grab your samples and I'll pull the probe." "I'm not sure we should," Lena began, but Marco was already suiting up. The hatch hissed open and Marco stepped out into the swirling winds, tethered to the lander. He reached the probe and yanked it free from the webbing. The structure reacted instantly. The fibers contracted around the gap, and the entire mass began to shudder violently. "Marco, get back here!" Voss shouted. Before Marco could move, a massive shadow passed overhead. The lander's lights flickered and the temperature inside dropped sharply. "Something's out there," Zeke said, his voice barely above a whisper. The shadow returned, and this time they saw it, an enormous, multi-limbed creature, its form constantly shifting as if cloaked by the very air around it. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, blending perfectly with the storm. It moved with predatory grace, circling the lander like a shark. "Marco, now!" Voss barked. Marco sprinted back, diving into the hatch just as the creature struck. Its limbs slammed into the craft, sending it spinning. Inside, alarms blared, and the crew scrambled to stabilize the vessel. The creature's limbs latched onto the hull, its form partially visible now, grotesque and sinewy, covered in chameleon-like scales that shifted through patterns of blue and black. "We're not gonna make it," Zeke yelled, his hands flying over the controls. "We will," Voss said, his voice steady despite the panic in his gut. "Marco, eject the tether. Now!" Marco obeyed, severing the lander's connection to the alien structure. The sudden jolt dislodged the creature, and the craft lurched upward, engines straining as they climbed back toward the Astoria. The creature didn't follow. It lingered near the web-like mass, its eyes, or what they assumed were eyes, locked onto the fleeing vessel. It watched them, unblinking, as the storm swallowed its form once more. Inside the lander, the crew sat in stunned silence, the only sound their labored breathing. Lena finally broke it. "That thing, it wasn't just alive, it was hunting us." Voss stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "We're not out of this yet." As the lander docked with the Astoria, the rhythmic signal pulsed again, louder and clearer than before. It felt closer now, as if the storm itself was alive and waiting. The Astoria shuddered as the landing craft docked, its crew stumbling out, disheveled and shaken. Voss was the last to exit, his gaze lingering on the viewport. Neptune's storms churned below, vast and unrelenting, a monstrous ballet that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the signal. He clenched his fists and turned away. Whatever they had encountered down there wasn't finished with them. Marco leaned against a wall, breathing heavily, sweat slick on his brow. That was close. Too close. "It's not over," Lena said, pulling off her helmet and immediately moving to her workstation. "I need to analyze the samples from the probe. If those structures were alive, and they were, they might have left traces on the equipment." "We'll debrief later," Voss interrupted. "Marco, Zeke, secure the craft. Lena, get your analysis started. I want everyone on high alert." As they dispersed, Marco stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wall. Voss noticed but didn't say anything. The team was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. Not yet. Hours passed in tense silence as Lena worked in the lab, her console casting faint green light across her face. Voss stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her work. She didn't speak until she had something concrete. "This isn't right," she muttered, pointing at her screen. "The probe's surface is covered in microscopic organisms, parasites, but unlike anything I've seen. They're active, binding to the material, almost like they're feeding." "What does that mean for us?" Voss asked, his voice calm but cold. Lena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the console. "It means if they're on the probe, they could be on us. We might have brought them aboard." Before Voss could respond, the lights flickered, and a low, groaning sound echoed through the ship. The faint signal, the rhythmic pulse, returned, this time resonating through the hull itself. "Bridge to Voss," Zeke's voice crackled over the comms. "We've got a situation." Voss and Lena hurried to the bridge where Zeke was frantically working the controls. "Something's wrong with the environmental systems," he explained. "Airflow's uneven, and I'm getting weird pressure readings from multiple decks." "Could it be the storm?" Voss asked. Zeke shook his head. "No way. This feels internal, like something spreading through the ship." "Quarantine all affected areas," Voss ordered. "We can't risk this spreading any further." Before Zeke could respond, a scream echoed through the comms. It was Marco. The three of them sprinted to the crew quarters, where they found Marco curled on the floor, convulsing. His veins bulged darkly beneath his skin, and his eyes were wide, glassy, and unseeing. Lena knelt beside him, scanning him with a handheld device. "He's infected," she said grimly. "The parasites, he must have come into contact with them during the landing." Marco's body jerked violently, his skin beginning to ripple unnaturally. His fingers elongated, the bones stretching and cracking beneath the surface. He screamed again, his voice raw and guttural as his transformation accelerated. "Get back!" Voss shouted, pulling Lena away. Marco's form was no longer human. His skin had turned translucent, exposing dark, web-like veins filled with something that shimmered and moved independently. His limbs stretched grotesquely, his jaw unhinging in an unnatural way as he turned to face them. His eyes, now reflective and alien, locked onto Voss. "Help me," Marco rasped, his voice distorted, a chilling mix of human and something else. "We can't," Lena whispered, backing away. Marco lunged, faster than they expected. Voss shoved Lena aside and fired his weapon, the shot tearing through Marco's mutated body. He fell, twitching, but the parasite-driven changes didn't stop. His body continued to writhe, new limbs beginning to sprout. "We have to contain this," Lena said, her voice trembling. "If it spreads..." Voss didn't wait. He activated the quarantine system, sealing the section with Marco's body inside. Through the reinforced glass, they watched as his transformation completed, leaving a creature barely recognizable as human. It paced the room, its head twitching unnaturally, testing the walls with clawed appendages. But Marco wasn't the only problem. Alarms blared as the ship's internal sensors detected breaches across multiple decks. The parasites were spreading, feeding on the ship's systems, converting metal and circuitry into organic, pulsating growths. The Astoria itself was becoming infected. "It's not just Marco," Zeke said, panic rising in his voice. "The whole ship, it's alive." From the viewport, a shadow passed, massive and deliberate. The creature they'd seen in the atmosphere was here, clinging to the Astoria's hull, its translucent body shimmering as it moved. It was no longer hunting them. It was herding them, driving them into chaos. "We need to leave," Lena said. "Now. If the parasites take the ship, we're dead." Voss shook his head. "Not yet. We have to stop this here. If we abandon ship, we risk bringing this infection back to Earth." "And if we stay, we die," Zeke shouted. The rhythmic signal pulsed again, stronger than before. This time it was inside their heads, filling their minds with fragmented alien thoughts, images of the storm, the web-like structures, the creatures. Voss gritted his teeth, forcing the images out of his mind. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "We end this, or no one else makes it out alive." The ship groaned beneath their feet, a low, resonant sound that carried through the corridors like the moan of a dying beast. The Astoria was falling apart, its systems overtaken by the parasitic infestation. The once pristine walls were now veined with dark, pulsating growths, alien tendrils winding through every console and bulkhead. The lights flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the engine room, Voss, Lena, and Zeke huddled over the central console. Sweat glistened on their faces, and the air reeked of something foul, organic and rotten. The rhythmic pulse of the alien signal thrummed through the walls, louder now, as if mocking them. "It's spreading too fast," Zeke said, his voice trembling. "The core's already compromised. If we don't..." "We know," Voss snapped, cutting him off. His hands gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. He turned to Lena. "Can we override the reactor? Force it into overload?" Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to the alien growths creeping toward the controls. "Maybe, but it won't be enough. The reactor won't trigger unless it's stable for the sequence. And with the systems corrupted, there has to be a way," Voss said. His voice carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. "There is," Lena said softly, not meeting his gaze. "Someone has to stay. Manually hold the sequence in place while the rest escape." Silence fell over them, the reality of her words sinking in. Zeke looked between them. his eyes wide with fear. No way. There has to be another option. There isn't, Lena said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. If the ship reaches critical mass, it'll destroy everything. The parasites, the creature, the infection. But it can't be done remotely. Someone has to stay behind. I'll do it, Voss said without hesitation. His tone was calm, resolute. No, Lena protested. You can't. It's my responsibility, he said, cutting her off. This mission, this crew, everything that's happened here, it's on me. I won't let this reach Earth. Zeke stepped forward, shaking his head. But there's still a chance we can... No, there isn't, Voss said, his voice softening. You and Lena are the only chance humanity has of understanding what happened here. You're the ones who can make sure this never happens again. Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue further. She knew Voss was right. She placed a hand on his arm, squeezing it tightly. We'll make it mean something, she said. I promise. Voss nodded, then turned to Zeke. Get the shuttle prepped. You've got 5 minutes. As Zeke sprinted from the engine room, Lena lingered for a moment, her eyes locked on Voss. The signal pulsed again, more intense this time, and the walls trembled. The alien presence was closing in. Go, Voss said, his voice soft but commanding. This isn't goodbye. Lena hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. Thank you, she whispered before turning and running toward the escape shuttle. Alone now, Voss took a deep breath and faced the reactor controls. The alien growths were everywhere, pulsating with life, but he pushed past his fear. His hands flew over the console, bypassing corrupted systems, forcing the reactor into overload. The ship groaned in protest, alarms blaring as the countdown began. The alien signals screamed in his mind, a cacophony of rage and desperation. Through the viewport, Voss saw the massive, sinewy creature clinging to the ship's hull. Its translucent form shimmered, its limbs thrashing as if it understood what was happening. It began to tear into the ship, its claws raking through metal and alien growth alike, desperate to stop him. But Voss held firm. He thought of his crew, of Lena, Zeke, Marco. He thought of Earth, the billions of lives that depended on them. And he thought of his own failures, the ghosts that had haunted him since the last mission he couldn't save. This time, he would make it right. The countdown reached its final seconds as the escape shuttle launched, streaking away from the Astoria and into the vast emptiness of space. Voss watched it go, a small, fleeting point of light against the darkness. The reactor reached critical, and the Astoria erupted in a brilliant explosion, a fiery wave of light and energy that consumed the ship, the creature, and the infection in an instant. The alien signal was silenced, the storm dissipating as the hive mind was obliterated. In the shuttle, Lena and Zeke watched the explosion from the viewport, their faces etched with grief and relief. The Astoria was gone, but so was the threat. The cost was unbearable, but it had saved them all. Lena turned away, clutching a small vial in her hand, the only remaining sample of the parasite, sealed and inert. She stared at it for a long moment, then crushed it beneath her boot. We'll make it mean something, she whispered, echoing her promise to Voss. The shuttle drifted into the vastness of space, carrying its survivors toward an uncertain future. But for now, they had won. The nightmare was over, or so they hoped.